Have you ever wondered what secrets can hide inside a photograph that looks completely normal? This image from 1904 shows what anyone would describe as a typical family portrait. A well-dressed gentleman, his respectable wife seated beside him, and in the background, a young indigenous servant girl with her hands crossed over her belly. At first glance, it looks like a simple historical document, a snapshot of the social hierarchies that defined early 20th century Mexico, where wealthy landowners and merchants held absolute power over indigenous workers who had no legal rights or protections of any kind. But when researchers began analyzing every detail of this photograph, they discovered something that would forever change the understanding of what was really happening inside that house. Stay with me, because today you're going to learn the complete story of Maria Tecuani, a young indigenous woman of 21 years who was found dead on the road to Oaxaca in 1905, with this photograph as the only clue to her true identity. Before we begin, subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and tell me in the comments what city you're watching from. Your support helps us keep sharing stories that deserve to be remembered. This is not just a story of a photograph. It is a story of a woman who chose to die free rather than live enslaved. A secret hidden for over a century. A decision that changed the destiny of 200 families. If you stay until the end, you will discover why Maria Tecuani became a symbol of resistance, and how one night in December 1904 became an act of courage that still moves us today. Look carefully at the hands of the young woman standing in the background of the image. That protective gesture over her belly is not accidental. It is the instinctive posture of a woman who knows she carries something inside her more valuable than her own life. Because Maria Tecuani was hiding a secret. One that, when discovered 3 days after this photograph was taken, would put in danger not only her existence, but the reputation of an entire aristocratic family. This is Maria Tecuani, recorded in the 1904 municipal census of Puebla simply as indigenous servant in the household of the Maid de la Vega family. But Maria was far more than a bureaucratic description. She was a young Nahua woman of 21 years, a member of one of Mexico's oldest indigenous peoples, the same civilization that built great empires long before European contact, who had been separated from her family at the age of 14. She was handed over as payment for a debt following the devastating drought of 1897 that destroyed her home village in the mountains of Puebla. The man in the photograph is Don Ricardo Montemayor, a prosperous 45-year-old merchant, respected in the social circles of Puebla's capital. Beside him, his wife, Dona Isabel de la Vega, heir to one of the most traditional families in the region, a woman of deep religious convictions and rigid ideas about social order. To them, Maria was not a person with a name in her own history. She was simply the Indian, another piece of household furniture. But there is something in this photograph that reveals a far more complex truth. Notice the exact distance between the figures, the way Maria keeps her eyes slightly averted from the camera, and above all, that protective gesture of her hands over her belly. These are details that would go unnoticed by any casual observer, but which take on a devastating meaning when you know the full story. The photograph was taken by Monsieur Henry Lunier, a French traveling photographer who moved through the wealthy homes of Mexico, capturing the portraits of high society. According to his studio records, the session at the Montemayor house lasted barely 15 minutes on December 15th, 1904. 15 minutes that capture for eternity the last moment of apparent normality before everything fell apart. Because what nobody knew in that moment was that Maria was 5 months pregnant, not with one, but with 2 babies. Twin boys, growing in secret inside the body of a woman who, under the social laws of the time, had no rights even over her own body. And the father of those children was not a worker of her own social standing. It was Don Ricardo Montemayor himself, the man standing in the photograph with an air of patriarchal respectability. To understand how we arrived at this moment, we must go back 7 years to that day in 1897, when Maria was torn from her world and handed into a life of servitude that would mark her destiny forever. Maria had been born in 1883 in a small Nahua village nestled in the mountains of Puebla, where her mother Itzel worked as a weaver and her father cultivated native maize on the steep hillsides of Sierra. She was an intelligent girl who had learned both the Nahuatl language of her ancestors, an ancient tongue still spoken today by over 1 million people in Mexico, and the Spanish necessary to trade in the larger village markets. Her dark eyes shone with a natural curiosity that her mother fed by teaching her not only domestic skills, but also ancestral knowledge about medicinal plants and the protection rituals that the women of her lineage had kept for centuries. But the drought of 1897 changed everything. For 8 consecutive months, the rains did not come. The fields dried up, the livestock died, and families began to face starvation. Maria's father, desperate to feed his wife and 3 younger children, accepted Don Ricardo Montemayor's offer. 20 silver pesos in exchange for his eldest daughter working in the family home until things improved. Maria was 14 years old when the carriage pulled away from her village, carrying her to a world she did not understand and from which she would never return. Her mother had pressed into her hands a small woven shawl made by her grandmother, the only object she would keep from her former life. "You are sacred seed, my daughter," her mother had whispered to her in Nahuatl as she held her for the last time. "No matter where they plant you, you will find a way to bloom." The Montemayor house was a palace compared to the humble adobe home where Maria had grown up. High ceilings, marble floors, furniture imported from Europe, and portraits of Spanish ancestors that seemed to judge her from their gilded frames. But all that opulence made her feel smaller and more invisible than ever. Josefina, the mestiza cook of 50 years, was the one who received her with a mixture of compassion and pragmatism. "There are rules here that are not written down, girl, but they can save your life," she whispered on the first day. "Never look directly at the masters, never speak unless spoken to, and never, never be alone with the master of the house." During the first years, Maria learned to move through the house like a ghost. She woke before dawn to light the stove, prepared tortillas, served the coffee that Don Ricardo drank while reading the Puebla Herald, cleaned the fine furniture, and went to bed after everyone had finished dinner, in a small room next to the kitchen that she shared with 2 younger maids. The work was exhausting, but what hurt most was the loneliness. She had lost not only her family, but her identity. They had forbidden her from speaking Nahuatl, changed her original name for a more Christian one, and little by little the words of her mother tongue began to fade from her memory like leaves carried off by wind. Yet Maria developed small acts of silent resistance to keep her essence alive. At night, when everyone slept, she would whisper the songs her mother had taught her. She had managed to plant a small secret garden behind the kitchen where she grew medicinal herbs she recognized from her childhood. Episode for stomach pain, rue to ward off bad energy, chamomile to calm the nerves. It was her way of maintaining a connection to the world she had lost. She had also found comfort in the visits of Father Miguel Hernandez, a young seminary student who came weekly to give catechism classes to the neighborhood children. He had noticed Maria's natural intelligence and, moved by her situation, began teaching her to read and write during the afternoons when Dona Isabel went out for her social engagements. God loves all his daughters equally, Father Miguel would tell her. Your origins do not define your worth in the eyes of the Lord. For Maria, those words were like fresh water in the desert of her existence. For the first time in years, someone was treating her as though she had intellectual and human value. But not everyone in the house looked kindly on this attention toward Maria. Dona Isabel had begun to notice that her servant no longer kept her eyes permanently lowered, that she sometimes smiled without apparent reason, that she had developed a more upright posture. Indigenous women must be kept in their place, she wrote to her sister in a letter preserved in the family archives. If you give them confidence, they forget who they are. And it was precisely at this moment of relative hope that Don Ricardo began to show a particular interest in Maria that would change everything forever. At first, there were seemingly innocent compliments about her work. "Maria cooks better than many society ladies," he would tell guests while she served the food, her cheeks burning with shame. Then came the small gifts, a piece of blue ribbon, a sweet fruit, a silver coin for her good work. Maria, who had never received gifts in her life, did not know how to interpret these attentions. In her innocence, she began to believe that perhaps Don Ricardo saw her as something more than a simple servant. She could not imagine that those gifts were part of a calculated strategy to earn her trust, the prelude to something far more sinister. The night of June 15th, 1904 marked the end of Maria's innocence forever. Dona Isabel had traveled to Mexico City to visit her sick sister, and the house had fallen into a silence that foreshadowed the coming storm. Maria, who had just turned 21 barely a month before, was mending a dress by candlelight when she heard soft knocking at her door. "Maria, I need you to help me with some important documents," said Don Ricardo's voice from the hallway. She stood up quickly, not suspecting that there were no documents to review, that this lie was only the pretext for something that would change her life forever. What happened in Don Ricardo's study that night was recorded by Maria years later in a letter she wrote but never sent, found decades later between the pages of a prayer book. "I could not scream," she wrote in a trembling hand. "I could not resist. I could only close my eyes and pray to Nansen take me far away from there." When Don Ricardo finished, Maria had blood on her legs and tears. She could not stop. He handed her a silk handkerchief and a gold coin. "This stays between us," he said, now without the massive kindness he had worn for months. "If you speak, I will throw you into the street, and an Indian without protection does not last long in this city." Maria returned to her room walking as if in a dream. She washed herself with cold water, changed her torn dress, and sat on her small bed staring at the gold coin in her hands. It was more money than she had ever seen, but it felt like the price of her soul. During the following weeks, Don Ricardo established a cruel routine. 2 or 3 times per week, when Dona Isabel was distracted or had gone out, he would find excuses to be alone with Maria, always with the same promise of protection, always with the same veiled threat if she resisted. Maria learned to function like an automaton during the day, cooking, cleaning, serving, smiling when necessary. But at night she cried in silence until the tears ran out, and only a painful emptiness remained where hope had once been. It was during this nightmare that Maria began to notice changes in her body. At first she thought it was stress, sadness, the constant fear that gnawed at her from within. But when her menstruation was late for the second time, a terrible understanding began to form in her mind. One morning in August, while washing clothes in the back courtyard, she felt a nausea so intense she had to sit down on the ground. Josefina, who had been watching her with growing concern, came close and looked her directly in the eyes. "Girl," she said in a very low voice, "when was your last monthly?" Maria burst into tears. There was no need for words. Josefina understood immediately what had been happening in that house for months. With a silent fury Maria had never seen in her, the cook embraced her and whispered, "That wretch, that cursed wretch." But when Josefina placed her experienced hand over Maria's belly, her expression changed. "Girl," she murmured in astonishment and terror, "this is not one baby. It's 2. In a society that already viewed mixed-race children as a scandal, Maria was carrying 2 lives that would represent a double catastrophe. 2 living reminders of Don Ricardo's betrayal. 2 children that Dona Isabel would never allow to be born. For 5 months, Maria managed to hide her condition, using tight binding and increasingly loose dresses. Josefina helped her in secret, obtaining herbs to control the nausea and teaching her techniques to conceal her growing belly. But both women knew that time was running out. It was December 15th, 1904, exactly the day the photograph was taken, when Maria felt for the first time the clear movements of the twins she was carrying. It was during the session with the French photographer that the babies moved with such force that she had to press her hands against her belly to calm them. That protective gesture we see in the image was not posed by the photographer. It was the purest maternal instinct, the same gesture made by Nawa women of her people when they prayed to Nansen, the ancestral mother. Maria was protecting her children even before they were born, unconsciously preparing herself for the battle that was coming. Because 3 days after that photograph, on December 18th, 1904, everything fell apart. Maria was serving afternoon tea when a sudden dizziness made her stumble. A delicate porcelain cup shattered on a marble floor, and when Dona Isabel came closer to help her, she felt the hardness of the belly beneath her dress. Isabel's eyes filled with frozen fury. "How long?" was the only thing she asked. Maria, trembling, could not answer, but her silence was confession enough. That night, Dona Isabel summoned her husband to her study. According to letters from a neighbor, shouting was heard until well past midnight. But Maria knew nothing of that. She remained locked in her room, protected with her hands the belly where her children were growing. not imagining that her fate was being decided in the room next door. The following morning, Isabel presented her ultimatum. Maria had two options: go to the market healer to resolve her problem, or leave the house that same night with nothing more than the clothes on her back. Isabel placed a small pouch of silver coins on the table. "This will be enough for the healer to do her work," she said with a coldness that cut like a knife. "Or you can leave now and see how long your principles last when you're dying of hunger on the road." Maria looked at the coins. It was more money than she had ever seen together in her entire life. Enough to free her family from debt. Enough to buy seeds and tools for an entire growing season. But when she brought her hands to her belly, she felt the subtle movement of the babies growing inside her. And in that moment, her mother's voice echoed in her memory like an ancestral call. "You are sacred seed, my daughter." "I cannot," whispered Maria with tears running down her cheeks. "I cannot kill the only thing in this world that is mine." The slap from Isabel rang out like a gunshot. Maria felt the taste of blood in her mouth, but she did not lower her gaze. For the first time in 7 years of servitude, she had refused to obey. For the first time, she had chosen to defend something she considered sacred above her own safety. "You have until dawn to reconsider," said Isabel, pointing to the door. "If you haven't resolved this before sunrise, I will throw you into the street with nothing." Maria left the study with a swollen face and a broken heart, but also with something she had never felt before: the dignity of having chosen. In her small room, as she packed her few belongings into the worn shawl that had belonged to her mother, Maria felt the movements of her babies. "I will not let them kill you," she whispered to them in Nahuatl. "I would rather we die free than live as slaves." She kept the seeds of native maize that had been her connection to her roots, took the small crucifix that Father Miguel had given her, and wrapped herself in the shawl that had belonged to her mother, the only object she had kept from her former life. When the church clock struck 3 in the morning, Maria opened the door of her room for the last time. Outside, a cold drizzle was creating puddles in the cobblestone courtyard. Her bare feet touched the frozen ground, but her heart burned with a determination she had never felt before. She walked to the front door of the house, but before opening it, she stopped in front of the hallway mirror. For 7 years, she had passed that mirror without really looking at herself, as if she were invisible even to her own eyes. But that night, in the moonlight filtering through the windows, Maria saw herself for the first time not as a servant, but as a woman who had chosen freedom. The door closed behind her with a soft but final sound. There were no screams, no pursuit, only the silence of a sleeping city and the echo of her footsteps on the wet cobblestones. Maria Tecuani, 21 years old, pregnant with twins, without money and without a destination, began walking south toward Oaxaca, where she knew indigenous communities existed that might take her in. The road from Puebla to Oaxaca in 1904 was dangerous for any traveler, but for a young woman, pregnant and alone, it was practically a death sentence. Bandits controlled many stretches of the route. Diseases like yellow fever and malaria struck weakened travelers. Rural communities were suspicious of strangers. But Maria had made her decision. She preferred to face the uncertainty of the road over the certainty of humiliation. She carried with her her mother's teachings about medicinal plants, ancestral knowledge about navigating by the stars, and an iron determination to protect her children no matter the cost. During the first days, some muleteers and merchants offered her rides in their carts. But when they noticed her condition, their looks turned suspicious. A pregnant woman traveling alone could only mean trouble, and nobody wanted complications. Maria learned to travel at night, when the roads were quieter. She fed herself with roots and wild fruit she recognized from her childhood, drank from streams and springs, and slept hidden in the vegetation when exhaustion overcame her. In the town of Atlixco, halfway between Puebla and Oaxaca, a family of Zapotec traders, another of Mexico's ancient indigenous peoples, found her collapsed by the roadside. The woman, named Esperanza, immediately recognized the signs. Maria was on the verge of labor. "You cannot keep traveling like this," said Esperanza, helping her up. "The children will come soon. I can feel it." But Maria refused to stop. She knew Don Ricardo had contacts throughout the region. If she stayed too long in one place, they would find her and force her to return. "I must reach Oaxaca," she insisted. There I will be safe. Esperanza helped as best she could, giving her food, a thicker blanket, and most importantly, information about the road ahead. There's a cave 2 days march to the south, she explained. Travelers use it as shelter. You can rest there when the moment comes. Maria continued her journey, but every step was harder than the last. The twins moved constantly, as if they knew their birth was approaching. Her legs swelled, her back arched under the weight of her belly, and contractions began 3 weeks earlier than expected. It was in that cave that Maria Tecuani lived the most difficult moment of her life. Completely alone, with only the stars as witnesses, she gave birth to her twin boys in the early hours of February 2nd, 1905. The first baby, a boy, was born without complications, but the second, also a boy, came in a difficult position. Maria had to use every piece of knowledge she had absorbed from watching the midwives of her village to save the life of her second son. When she was finally able to hold both babies, crying, exhausted, but victorious, she whispered the words her mother had told her years before. "You are sacred seed, my children." She named them Miguel and Carlos, after the archangels of protection. But the birth was only the beginning. Maria now had to find a way to feed and protect 2 newborns while completing her journey to safety. Her strength was at its limit. She had lost a great deal of blood during labor, and the babies needed constant warmth and feeding. It was then that what Maria always considered a miracle occurred. A caravan of Zapotec traders returning to Oaxaca after selling their goods at the central markets found her in the cave with her babies. Don Aurelio Vasquez, the leader of the group, was moved by the young mother's courage. "No woman should go through this alone," he said, ordering his wife to help Maria prepare travel. The caravan modified its itinerary to accommodate Maria and her babies. They traveled slowly, stopped frequently so she could nurse the children, and the women of the group took turns helping with the newborns' care. When they finally arrived at San Antonio Castillo Velasco, a Zapotec village in the mountains of Oaxaca, the community received Maria as if she were family. They asked no questions about her past, passed no judgment on her status as a single mother. They simply welcomed her with the ancestral hospitality that has characterized indigenous communities for generations. Here, all mothers are respected. The village midwife, an elderly woman named Luz, told her, "Your children will grow up free, without invisible chains, without masters to humiliate them." Maria settled in San Antonio with the help of the whole community. They built her a small adobe house, gave her seeds to cultivate a garden, and little by little she began to heal the physical and emotional wounds of her terrible experience. But Maria did not simply settle for surviving. Using the herbal knowledge she had inherited from her mother and perfected through her years of suffering, she began to work as the village midwife and healer. Her first assisted birth was that of a young woman who had arrived in the village under circumstances similar to her own. As she helped bring the baby into the world, Maria felt she had found her true vocation: to protect other mothers, to ensure no woman would go through what she had lived. Miguel and Carlos grew up as beloved sons of the entire community. They learned both Spanish and Zapotec, studied in the village school, and developed a profound respect for education and social justice that would mark their futures. Miguel became the first indigenous teacher in the region, founding rural schools where he taught in native languages. Carlos dedicated himself to farming, developing sustainable cultivation techniques that improved food production across the whole area. But the story does not end there. In 1994, when the descendants of the Montemayor family were emptying the ancestral home to sell it, they found that photograph forgotten in a trunk in the attic. The image puzzled them. Who was that young indigenous woman appearing alongside their grandparents? Esperanza Montemayor, a historian and great-great-granddaughter of Don Ricardo, began an investigation that led her to San Antonio Castillo Velasco, where she discovered that Maria Tecuani had not only survived, but had become a local legend. During her 89 years of life, Maria had helped bring more than 400 babies into the world. She never lost a birth, never let mother die, and always repeated the same words to every woman she assisted. "You are sacred seed, my daughter." When Maria died in 1972, more than 1,000 people attended her funeral. She had helped bring 3 complete generations of the village into the world. On her gravestone, by her own request, were inscribed words in Nahuatl, Tonalin Emilisli, meaning soul of life. Miguel Tecuani became one of the most respected educators in Oaxaca, founding more than 20 rural schools and training hundreds of indigenous teachers. Carlos developed a sustainable agriculture program that transformed the economy of the region, allowing communities to achieve food self-sufficiency. But perhaps Maria's most powerful legacy was the example of dignity she left behind. Proof that even in the most adverse circumstances, a mother can choose love over fear, freedom over comfort, dignity over survival. Today in San Antonino, Castillo Velasco, there is a health center bearing the name of Maria Tecuani. It serves pregnant women from across the region and operates on a simple philosophy. Every life is sacred. Every mother deserves respect. It is led by her great-granddaughters, who continue her legacy of protecting the most vulnerable women. The photograph from 1904, which had remained forgotten for decades, is now displayed in the community museum of the village as a testament to courage and resistance. Beside it, a plaque reads, Maria Tecuani, 1883 to 1972, mother, midwife, guardian of lives. Her courage changed the destiny of generations. Esperanza Montemayor, after learning the true story, made a decision that honored Maria's memory. She donated half of the family inheritance to create a scholarship fund for young indigenous women who want to study medicine and midwifery. It is the least I can do, she said, to repair the damage my family caused more than a century ago. Don Ricardo Montemayor died in 1923 at the age of 64, having developed a strange obsession with looking out the window each morning, as if waiting to see Maria return down the road. His last words, according to the testimony of the nurse who cared for him, were, "Tell Maria I'm sorry." But Maria was not there to hear him. Dona Isabel lived until 1941, but never mentioned Maria's name again. She ordered the room where the young woman had lived to be converted into a pantry. As if by erasing the space, she could also erase the memory of what happened. Yet on December nights, when the wind whistled to the roof tiles, the household servants swore they could hear the echo of songs in Nahuatl that chilled the blood. Father Miguel Hernandez continued his pastoral work until his death in 1948. In his diary, preserved in the diocesan archives, he wrote about Maria until the very end. I have known few souls as pure as that young indigenous woman. Her courage in choosing freedom over security continues to inspire me every day of my ministry. Josefina, the cook who had been Maria's only ally in the Montemayor house, kept for the rest of her life the medicinal herbs that the young woman had planted in her secret garden. Every time she prepared chamomile tea or used episode in the kitchen, she would whisper, "May God bless her wherever she may be." But the most moving story of all is the one Esperanza discovered when she visited San Antonino, Castillo Velasco, for the last time in 2010. Necli Tecuani, Maria's great-grandson and then 89 years old, took her to a special place, a small cemetery on the top of a hill where a simple wooden cross marked Maria's grave. My great-grandmother said she wanted to rest looking north. Necli explained with an emotional voice, toward Puebla, not out of nostalgia, but to always remember where she had come from and what she had overcome. She said her story was not one of victim, but a victory. At the foot of the grave was something extraordinary, a garden of native maize growing wild, plants that had sprouted from the seeds Maria had carried with her in her escape more than 100 years before. The maize was still growing generation after generation as a living symbol of resistance and continuity. Esperanza stayed there for hours, contemplating an image that summarized the whole story. The seeds Maria had saved, planted, and cultivated had outlived all of her oppressors. They had fed hundreds of families, preserved ancient varieties, and stood as silent testimony that life always finds a way to prevail over death. When she returned, Esperanza wrote a book about Maria's story that became required reading in schools across the region. But more importantly, she established a protocol in the public hospitals where she worked as a physician. All medical staff must treat indigenous patients with the same respect and care as any other person, regardless of their social origin or economic standing. Maria Tecuani's story spread far beyond the limits of San Antonino, Castillo Velasco. Anthropologists, historians, and activists began documenting similar cases across Mesoamerica, discovering that Maria's experience was not unique, but representative of thousands of indigenous women who had faced similar abuse during the same era. In 2004, exactly 100 years after the photograph, the government of the state of Oaxaca declared February 2nd as the Day of Indigenous Maternal Dignity in honor of Maria Tecuani and all the women who had chosen freedom over submission. The health center bearing her name has served more than 10,000 pregnant women over the last 30 years. Statistics show they are one of the lowest maternal mortality rates in the entire region, not only because of medical quality, but because of the human and respectful treatment that defines their philosophy of care. Maria's great-granddaughters, who lead the center, have implemented innovative programs combining modern medicine with ancestral indigenous midwifery knowledge. Our great-grandmother taught us that every birth is sacred, explains Luz Elena Tecuani, director of the center. It doesn't matter if the mother is rich or poor, indigenous or not. Every woman deserves to give birth with dignity. But perhaps the deepest impact of Maria's story can be measured in the small daily decisions of women who have learned her example. Letters and testimonies arrive constantly at the museum where the photograph is displayed, from women who have found strength in her story to leave abusive relationships, to defend their rights, to protect their children, to choose freedom even when the cost seems too high. Maria taught me that true love sometimes requires painful decisions, wrote one young mother in a letter to the museum. When my husband began to hurt me, I remembered her story and understood that I had to leave to protect my baby. Today, my children and I live in peace, and every night I tell them about the brave woman who taught us that being a mother means being a protector. The photograph from 1904 still speaks across time. What appeared to be a normal image of social hierarchy revealed itself as a record of one of the most powerful acts of resistance in modern history. Maria Tecuani, with her protective hands over her belly, was not only guarding her unborn children, she was planting the seeds of a silent revolution that would change the lives of entire generations. Her story teaches us that true freedom is not found in comfort or security, but in the dignity of choosing our own path. That a mother willing to sacrifice everything for her children can change the destiny of hundreds of families. And that sometimes the most heroic acts are not performed on battlefields, but in the silent decisions we make in the early hours of morning, when no one is watching, when only we know what is at stake. In that photograph from 1904, Maria did not know her hands would become a universal symbol of maternal protection. She did not know that her decision to choose love over fear would become an inspiration for thousands of women. She did not know that her story, buried for a century, would rise again to remind us that human dignity is worth more than life itself. Because some stories, like some seeds, need time and new earth to bloom. Maria Tecuani's story is testimony that maternal love can overcome any oppression, that the courage of one woman can transform generations, and that even the most seemingly ordinary photographs can hide secrets that change our understanding of history and of ourselves. What would you have done in Maria's place? Having to choose between obeying to save yourself or resisting and risking everything? Do you believe that even today, imposed silences still force many women to hide their truth? What does the word freedom mean to you when the lives of your children are at stake? If you have made it this far, write the word seed in the comments, so we know you journeyed through this complete story until the very end. Tell us also what city you're watching from and what you thought of this story of resistance and maternal dignity. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel, leave a like, turn on notifications so you never miss our next stories worth remembering, and share this video with someone who values the memory of women like Maria Tecuani. And if you want to keep discovering photographs that hide extraordinary secrets, click on the video appearing on your screen now, where I'll tell you about an image from 1912 that changed the destiny of an entire revolution.